Everyone, and welcome again to our midweek Bible study and prayer time here at Chatham Heights Baptist Church. Glad that you've been able to join us today, whether you're joining us live or tuning in later in the day on this Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. And either way, however it is you're coming to us, we're glad to have you today. We ended our Bible study last week on the Sermon on the Mount. And we've been doing a little bit of everything, a book here, a book there, and then a couple of surveys. And if you can recall, I think the first, almost a year ago, the first study that we did was with the book of Mark. And then we also did a study on the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible, the Old Testament. Today we're going to go back to the Old Testament, and I hope that we'll be able to kind of find ourselves in the midst of the narrative that is there. But we're going to look in particular at the next following books after the Pentateuch. We're going to look at the books that follow from Joshua to the Kings, First and Second Kings, and basically going to be following the teaching book of an old professor of mine by the name of Marvin Tate. His book was entitled From Promise to Exile, and it kind of follows post-Moses, from the time of Joshua, the time of the Israelites entering the Promised Land, and then through their journeys and their good things and their mishaps and their sins, and eventually the loss of the very land God had promised them. I hope that we will find some lessons there for your life and for mine all these years later, because I think that is the beauty of Scripture, is that it becomes applicable to all of us and to different parts of our lives. We can find ourselves in the context of the story there. So let me give you a quick, brief rundown and introduction at our study. It takes place, as I mentioned before, with the book of Joshua. The first part is the book of Joshua. Now, Joshua follows their first 5 books that we studied some time back. Now, this is a survey, not a chapter by chapter, line by line kind of study. And what is happening, as you may recall, is that the Israelites are through wandering. Moses has been taken by God and has died on the mountain, looking over into the Promised Land, but not entering it. Joshua has the people by the Jordan River. They are ready to cross over, and the story then begins to unfold about possessing the Promised Land and about what they did with it, the things they learned or did not learn, the things that they discovered in their relationship with God and their relationship with neighbors and others, and eventually their own downfall, to their own negligence of the relationship with God and their own arrogance. And we're going to follow that through time there. The first 5 books are books that seemingly are filled with promise. Yes, there are some downsides in there, but for the most part, Genesis to Deuteronomy is the promise of God, and God choosing these people as his people, through whom God will reveal his love for all of creation, in particular for the world. But what we're going to look at is, how does Israel go from inhabiting this land of promise to then being expelled from it into a land of exile? New beginnings are promised, and then they are taken away. So Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, they're kind of what we often look at as historical books of the canon of Scripture. They're books that deal with the story. And when I say historical, don't think of them as history as we probably in our modern era think of. And what I mean by that is historical scholarship usually deals with going to first generation sources, being factual about the actual things, and then in some ways stripping legends that have developed off of the history. Well, in this case, these books are written within the purpose of revealing God. So it's not just about dates and facts and this kind. It's about God's interaction with his children in the midst of this. So I hope that you'll kind of join us there Joshua is going to talk about that early part. Judges is going to talk about that in between time of after having possessed much of the promised land and then clamoring for a king, but they're not ruled by king. It's kind of a confederation of different parts of the land that belong to the different tribes of Israel. And then, of course, Samuel follows later with the story of Saul being chosen as a king and from the prophet Samuel and David and then Solomon, and how it eventually, after Solomon, the kingdom splits into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And then eventually the northern kingdom is taken away in defeat, and all that's left is Judah. And then, of course, at the end, Judah will be likewise conquered along the way. Some different things. The language within these books is similar to what you read in Deuteronomy. Why is that? Well, if you can remember way back when we studied those books, um, the first 5 books of the Bible kind of show different traditions pulled together by the way that they're written. And one of the writers is not a writer, but a school of writers, so to speak. Were called the Deuteronomists. That was, a historical kind of position, and it's obvious that that same school of is the same school that is writing in much of this case of these books that we're looking at along the way. Um, they are, as I mentioned before, a matter of history, not about certainty, but about the historical understanding of God working with God's people. And so we want to kind of remember that going into it along the way. And I'm hoping that you'll find yourself invited into the story that takes place in Joshua's saga, in the Judges that follow. Boy, Judges to me is very revelatory about our lives and about ourselves. And of course, then later on, Ruth and the Kings and Samuel, all of those particular books. Most scholars feel that a lot of these works were put together as the kingdom grew, and perhaps the last time were, and understand this word edited means put together, more cohesion, more of a deliberate pattern of pulling all of these stories together during an era that may very well have been after the exile, at the latest, perhaps at the earliest, just before the exile in Josiah's time as a king. The purpose is to explain the story of Israel and the children of Israel. How despite being given the land in Canaan by Yahweh God, um, they lose it, and they end up losing it to a great disaster known as the exile. It is in the intention, I think, of these books to trace and demonstrate how the people of God failed God, but God did not fail the people of God along the way. Um, the land is going to become very important to them. Uh, the um, the land will take it on its own motif in a lot of ways, so to speak. Let's take a look now. We're going to start in the book of Joshua. And one of the things when we go through Joshua, you kind of, if you go to read it all, understand that whereas it's titled Joshua and it begins with Joshua, and most of you have that image in your mind of John Derrick, who played Joshua in the Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, that Charlton Heston Yul Brynner. That was John Derrick. Yes, that's right. Future husband of Bo Derek. That was portraying Joshua in that movie. But it begins with Joshua, but there will be times in the story that Joshua fades out of the scene somewhat. He disappears. He doesn't show up at key other parts of the story. In fact, another leader by the name of Phineas, who is more of a religious leader, if you will, seems to show up and act out as leader sometimes in Joshua's stead. Also, you might note, if we go through it, that Joshua does not seem to show up when bad things happen. It's almost like when Joshua shows up, the good things are happening. When he isn't, then there's some bad things that seem to show up. The thing that we kind of look at immediately is Joshua must be a continuation of Moses and Moses' people. that image of standing on the river and looking to cross over. These are the Hebrews that have wandered in the wilderness all these years. Only a couple are left from prior to that wandering, and Moses is even gone now. But some scholars note the fact that it's a timeless story not just for those children of Israel, but for the children of Israel who centuries later have been taken away from the promised land, moved to Babylon, and they're now at Jordan's River, perhaps again, looking to go back into the land God had promised, but a changed kind of people for a new land. Even though it's a familiar land, it is new for them. In the first 9 verses, you have this commissioning of Joshua. And one of the things that happens is that you're given a description of the promise of God. What does the land look like? What are the boundaries of this promised land? Well, God promises them. These are the boundaries. And he just starts describing it in verse 4. He says, from the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. So in other words, he kind of carves out that space to tell them this is the land that I was telling you about, the promise that I've given to you. When most people began to try to plot that out and see, well, what does that land look like? It wasn't their land right away, even in the conquest era. In fact, some have kind of noted that perhaps the boundaries were added to the story probably at least at David's time or after, because that would be the apex of the amount of land that Israel possessed during David's reign and Solomon's reign along the way. The verb God uses is give. I'm giving it to you. It indicates that Yahweh is about to give them the land, and Yahweh's purpose, God's purpose, is about to get in motion. And in verse 3 points that the decision's already made. And now we will begin that story of that decision. When God has a plan, God sees the plan through, but then God also leaves us the free will to undertake God's plan or not. And we'll discover through all of these stories that we will encounter in this Old Testament survey that a lot of these individuals, some of them chose not to participate. Oh, they didn't willfully say, God, I'm not going to be a part of this. They just tried to shape God's vision and God's challenge and God's plan to their own. And they would then harvest the consequences of that along the way. Right afterwards, they are given from God. Joshua is given from God the commands, the how they're going to go about possessing the land. And he instructs them how they're going to pay attention to the tribes over here on the eastern confluence near Jordan. They're going to be looking at a lot of different areas and places, and this is how you'll go and you'll conquer it. And of course, most of all, it's as he emphasizes this is a gift to you, a divine, if you will, a divine gift that is given from God to them. And one of the very first things that happens is in chapter 2, we are introduced to a most interesting lady by the name of Rahab. Now, in the very beginning of chapter 2, Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, I want you to go and view the land, especially take note of Jericho. And they went and they came into the house of a harlot, whose name was Rahab, and they lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, behold, certain men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. In other words, they're spying on us. And so the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, you bring me the men that have come to you who entered your house. They come to spy on us. But the woman had taken the 2 men and had hidden them. And she said, true men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when the gate was to be closed at dark, I think the men went out and so you better go after them and overtake them quickly. And what she did then was take them out onto the roof and hid them under the flax that covered the roof, so that they wouldn't be found. And the men pursued after them on the way across, on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. And then, of course, Rahab took care of the spies. Rahab is a very interesting person. First of all, she's not the person you figure God's going to use. Why do I say that? Well, from the very descriptive beginning, she is a harlot. I don't know that they look too well on those then, just as most don't now. But it's almost like the story of Rahab is inserted from a different place into the story of the conquering of the land. And it's included in Joshua because it's such a unique story. And it links itself by chapter 6 to the fall of Jericho. She's a non-Israelite. So, in other words, she's a Gentile. She's non-Hebrew. And what she's remembered for is her faith to a lot of people. In fact, it is in the New Testament. For example, in James chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, James wrote, you see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not Rachel the harlot also justified in works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? James was saying Rahab had faith, but when the time came, her faith produced good works for God. Rahab was like that in the sense that she becomes an interesting metaphor for the way that God uses all people to have his will fulfilled. Of course, one of the great parts of Rahab's story is that Rahab is later included in the book of Matthew as one of the forebearers of Jesus. When Matthew lists the family tree of Jesus, he goes out of his way to include old Rahab. Not many people. I've had one part of my family that has researched their genealogy, and that was well before Ancestry.com. That was the Reed family, and they did a really good job keeping alive the tradition, the story of the family. They also included the Rahabs of the world. For example, the sister of my great-grandfather was a lady by the name of Octavia. Octavia was actually committed to an insane asylum. And they didn't hide that. And some of you may even be saying maybe that's where Mike gets it. It's possible. Or the rest of my family for that matter. But nonetheless, here is Rahab. And God does not hide how Rahab is important to the story of God. And it's important to us here. And then as the story continues in Joshua in chapters 3 and 4, they cross the Jordan River. If you looked in those chapters, you would see that they're standing right on the edge of the river. And we're told in verse 3 that God had commanded the people, when you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, Joshua told them, your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place and you shall follow it. Now remember, the ark was built in the wandering days, and it was built in order to house the Ten Commandments, a jar of the manna, and the staff of Aaron. And these things were put inside of that chest, inside of the Ark of the Covenant. But more than that, the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God. It gave them something physical to look at, to remind them that God was with them. So it's no mistake and no accident, I would say, that as they begin to go into this land of promise to take it for their own, as God had promised them, that they're to follow the Ark of the Covenant, because, in other words, they are following the presence of God. Um, and so there they go, following the ark, carried by the priests at a safe distance from all the people. There's some interesting things that emerge from the narrative here. The importance of the presence of God that we've mentioned a moment ago is stressed, and that the priests are to be a roadway into the presence of God for them. The Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. If you continue with the story, the waters dry up, and they're able to cross across that dry spot to get into the promised land. Now, that, of course, sounds very familiar, and it should. It echoes when God delivered the children of Israel from Egypt and through Moses parted the Red Sea, and the children of Israel passed through on the other side and into their freedom and liberty. Here they're passing through into the land that God has promised for them. And of course, when you look at this, you recognize that God is already at work. In fact, there's a text in the 4th chapter in which it says that Yahweh has taken the courage from the people who inhabit the land. So in other words, God is going before them, sowing the seeds of victory for the children of Israel. In the 5th chapter, by the 5th chapter, the relationships between others around them and the relationship with God are starting to play out. In the 5th chapter, we discover that circumcision is instituted to all the males of Israel, and emphasizing the readiness of acceptance of willingly following God. It is the ancient mark of covenant between God and God's children, and they willingly undergo this in order to show that they are with God. Someone once pointed out the symbolism, if you will, particularly here, in the sense the old way of life is cut off and they are ready for the new life that God has called them to. For those of us who are Christians, by the time we get into the New Testament, circumcision is not the emphasis anymore, but taking, if you want to say taking its place in some ways symbolically, is baptism. Baptism becomes the profession of our faith and proclamation of our covenant with God along the way. The events in the 5th chapter then take place in Gilgal. And in this area known as Gilgal, they celebrate the Passover. And in celebrating the Passover, some interesting things happen. First of all, it marks the end of the wilderness period. There's no more manna. There's no need for it. The wandering is ending. Now it is time to go into this promised land. And they can eat, as God would tell them, of the produce of the land and the crops of the land of Canaan. And then another thing that we recognize is implicitly it marks the end of the Exodus and the fulfillment of the promise all the way back to Abraham, that God is now providing that land for them. God is often at work in our own lives, in the lives of our community, in the lives of our society. And we have to decide whether we are going to participate with God in those things or whether we are choosing not to participate. But one of the things about participating with God is to let God be God. In other words, we aren't participating just so we can show God the way. We instead are faithfully searching for, discerning, praying about our lives following God's way, and then others be called by God to that. Now, the middle of the 5th chapter and moving on into the 6th, or actually towards the end of the 5th chapter and on to the 6th, is that story that we grew up in Sunday school and Bible school about the fall and capture of Jericho. You remember the armies that traipsed around the city 7 times, blew their horns, and the walls fell. when you look at the story as is written, it's more than just that. God inspires Joshua to inspire the children of Israel and give them confidence that they will win the victory. Now, confidence is often overlooked when it comes to securing a victory. The sports metaphors are plentiful along the way. But I've always loved one, and since you deal with me and you have to live with me, there's always a Kentucky basketball story waiting somewhere. And in this case, I will always remember the story because I was young at the time. I'm 12 or 13 or whatever. And it was 1975, and Kentucky played Indiana in basketball early in the year and were throttled by the Hoosiers. Indiana beat them like 25 points or more at Indiana. It was an embarrassing loss. In fact, Bobby Knight and Joe Hall had a big blow up, and Bobby Knight cuffed Joe Hall in the back of the head to just show he could get away with anything he wanted. Well, later in the year in the NCAA tournament, their paths crossed again in the regional final. And there, Kentucky was about to take the floor against a team that had beaten them by about 25 early in the year. That was a 12 or 13 point favorite anyway to beat Kentucky. And they were 31-0 and undefeated, Indiana was. But Joe Hall stood in front of the team and he wrote different words up on the blackboard. He wrote the words nets, and as he wrote the word nets, he said, "Now, guys, I want you to know that whenever you climb up to cut the nets down after we win, don't get cut by the knife. Don't fall down and hurt yourself because we've still got a Final Four to go to." And then he put down after that buses. He said, "You'll be getting on the buses, and we will all be driving after it's over with back to Kentucky." We will go on I-75 and go together. And then he wrote down the Coliseum to Memorial Coliseum, and we will have a big rally with the public and with students and with everybody. And so just have yourself a great time and just go out and be excited about this wonderful chance to finally beat these guys. What in the world, all the players said, are you doing? And what he was doing was telling him he believed in him. And sure enough, they did go out and defeat Indiana 92-90, and in probably one of the most physical games I ever saw. And the result is confidence plays an important part. And so we have to understand that it's important to us to be confident that God is at work. Even if we don't get it, we don't believe it right now, or it certainly doesn't appear like God is at work, we trust that God is at work along the way. So we want to remember that that's as ancient as God dealing with Joshua and with others, to instill that confidence that what God has promised, God is going to fulfill in some way or another. Well, the defeat of Jericho doesn't mark the end of it all. They end up going out in the 7th chapter. And after, well, let's back up in the beginning of 2nd chapter. A guy by the name of Achan has taken items from the spoils of Jericho that he was told not to. And so we're told the anger of the Lord burned against the Israelites. And so, Joshua, who'd sent these spies from Jericho to look at the land in the area, they had kind of gone without authorization to this new land called Ai. And it's spelled that, Ai. And Ai said, was a place where Israel decided they would attack, but God hadn't told them to. And the result was a defeat because they just ignored inviting God to be a part of that process. And then the remainder of the 7th chapter is kind of concerned because they feel like Achan has been the person who brought them this disaster. And so It's a sad story, but Achan is then taken out and stoned to death by the children of Israel, buried into a valley that is entitled the Valley of Achor, um, or translated meaning the Valley of Troubles. Um, and then the after Achan is dead, there's a famous verse in the chapter in the 8th chapter that says that the Lord turned from his burning anger. Um, that sounds kind of familiar. God does a lot of turning, particularly in the Old Testament, from his burning anger. You think of Noah, and after the flood, God, says, "I'm not going to do that anymore." He turns from his anger. He would turn from his anger here. He would turn from his anger in other places. Moses argued with him a lot of times to turn from his anger. So God, can be righteously angry at us, but turns from it in order for us to survive in a way. Now, afterwards, they go back to the town of Ai, and the result is they organize this attack. By the way, the AI city, the translation of that name is the ruin. I don't know if Ai was just the name the Israelites attached to it because they ruined it or they destroyed it, or if it was the actual name from Canaan. But if it was, you'd think the civic leaders would have wanted to change that name to live in a town called the Ruin. But it continues on. After their great victory at Ai, they build an altar in the 8th chapter, and then in the 9th chapter, there is this foreshadowing event. And I think we always think in the Old Testament as God dealing only with the Israelites, God aligning only with the Hebrews. And that's not always the case. In the 9th chapter, when all the kings who were beyond the Jordan in the hill country, and in the lowland all along the coast of the Great Sea towards Lebanon, and all these people that originally he had told Joshua, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of all of this, they gathered together to fight Joshua and Israel. But there was one land nearby, the Gibeons. And the Gibeons heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, and they decided, we're going to throw our lot in with the Israelites and with Joshua. And so they strike a covenant. Throughout that chapter, they strike a covenant together. The Hebrews and this Gentile Canaanite people known as the Gibeonites. And their plan is to get this treaty with Israel. And they decide, that they're going to cooperate along the way with them. Now, eventually what they discover is treachery, and Joshua will take care of them later on. But with this covenant with the Gibeonites, they are able to overtake the other 5 major kings with all of their help. They're encouraged by God again. Now, think about that for a second. God is not just using God's people. God is using those people. In this case, Gibeonites, Canaanites, Gentiles. Because God is the God of all people. Not just us, but them, kind of thing. And so we want to remember that. And even from the beginning, in the Old Testament, you see this coming out time and time again. God utilizing people who maybe didn't know who he was, but he knew who they were and reached out to them. One of the interesting things that happens is that the 5 kings, their armies are destroyed. Then they themselves, the kings, are hanged from the trees, which was a great disgrace. And according to the Old Testament, was cursed. Those who hanged from a tree were cursed by God. And that's why it would become so interesting when Jesus would hang from a tree, would be crucified from, what some would call a tree, which was, of course, the cross. And yet God redeems us through that cursedness that this world puts on things. More victories happen, more things take place. And we want to talk about some of this, and then the land eventually becomes distributed. But we want to do that a little bit more carefully. And so next week, we're going to look and talk about the themes that seem to come out of this story of Jericho and Ai and in the book of Joshua. And we're going to look these things over, and we're going to take a hard look at what they're kind of doing in our lives. Because God is doing something in our lives through these stories. We can find ourselves in there an awful lot of times. And then we'll proceed on, to the next. But I hope that you'll join me as we kind of take this journey. I know it's more of a survey. It's not a verse by verse. I invite you to take the time to do that reading yourself. A lot of great study Bibles out there that will help break down the individual stories and verses for you. But I wanted to give you a thumbnail sketch of what's happening. And through that, see where God is working with us as well. Now, I put an announcement on here in the last week, just a reminder that on May the 15th, from 11 to 1 o'clock, there'll be a drive-through bridal shower for Era Catherine Hall. Her wedding is coming up in the first weekend in June, and I want you to, if you wish to participate, feel free. I know there's a Facebook page you can go to. There's people you can contact. You can contact my wife, Susan Hatfield, and let her know that you want to participate or that you're coming. It's going to be interesting. They're trying to be socially distant and everything, but it's a drop-by kind of shower, from 11 to 1. So you don't have to come and stay. You come and Era Catherine, of course, will be blessed by all of you who've watched her grow up her entire life here and embarking on this journey together with Justin. So, wanted to get that announcement out there. And also, don't forget, if you wish to participate in the child dedication service that we're going to put in the worship time on May the 9th, on Mother's Day, I need to hear from you no later than Monday, the 26th, so that we can prepare for that. In doing that, I already tell you, I've got 2 families that have already committed to being there. So there's others. We will safely distance. We will, wear masks and do what we need to do so that we do not unintentionally, perhaps spread the COVID. Yes, even though a lot of us have had our shots, our vaccines, we still want to practice as best we can in extra safety along the way, while still doing the things that God has called us to do. So I hope that you will let me know about that for child dedication. We have a rather long list, as usual, it seems, for our prayer concerns. And if I do not, if I fail to mention someone that needs to bring attention, just leave a comment on this page underneath this Bible study. Put so-and-so's name down, maybe what they need prayer for, or maybe not, or if it's unspoken, put it there, just so we have able to share that in the future with you. A couple things. First of all, continue to remember Michelle Corbo, Phil's wife. Michelle, her mother died this past weekend and is up in New Jersey with them, and the services are this week. If you would remember Mavis Scott, Mary Helen Cameron's mother. Mavis is a member of this church, but she has been at Landmark in Stewart for a number of years. She's now on hospice care, and her time looks to be fairly short. So please hold her in your prayers, as well as Mary Helen and all the Cameron family, if you would. Remember Mary Lee Dove. She is having some kidney issues, and later next month we'll be looking at those. And then she has another visit with her lung doctor in a couple of weeks. So remember her in your prayers. Remember Marlene Meadows. Pray for strength for her. She's had a few uh, falls along the way, and just want to continue to pray for strength for her and her girls as they take care of her. Matt Fouts, I pray that you continue to remember Matt. Matt is, I just talked with Hyla this morning, and I'll just go ahead and tell you what they said. There's no set plan at the moment on terms of the cancer. The doctor says that they still don't have an exact type or origin for Matt's cancer. It is a very rare cancer that he has. But they will start radiation very soon for his leg, the broken leg, and he will also see a lung doctor for the 2 spots on his lungs and get a plan for chemotherapy. Right now they're baffled, but they're going to start with what they know. I, of course, share with Hyla that we've all known Matt is unique, but also he's a unique, special guy and a special fighter and follower of Christ. So I hope that you will continue to keep he and his family in your prayers. Paulette Martin, as she continues to recover from her surgery. Dave Maddox and Susan Hampton, likewise, from their hip surgeries. Jimmy Lewis was supposed to have a heart catheterization yesterday, but in the middle of the night between Monday and Tuesday, he had some very bad symptoms, felt bad, looked rough, was taken to the hospital. They did nitroglycerin, they did heparin, they did a little bit of everything for him, and then took him down to Moses Cone where he was to have the heart cath anyway. And as of this morning, they are looking at if he can. They did the heart cath yesterday, and they did not find any blockages. So they kind of ruled out the heart as the factor or the problem, but they're not sure what it is. So they're going to continue to look at some of that. But if he can walk down the hall okay today and everything, then Carol will be able to bring him home. So I pray that you would remember Jimmy. And I pray that you remember Carol, as she only one person allowed to go in there, and of course it's down in Greensboro. So just be with her in your prayers as well. Shirley Hyatt, who is looking and facing it, perhaps having a pacemaker or a defibrillator put in, and of course there's some trepidation with a lot of that. Remember Smitty, Carol Smith's going to be having knee surgery on May the 10th. Gary Dove, who is having some issues and problems that he has to take care of with Dr. O'Neill. And then, of course, the Turners, John and Jay, I ask you to remember them as well. Let us together join our hearts and our minds and souls in prayer. Gracious Lord, and we call you gracious because you really are. Lord, we come before you, and as the old song used to sing, standing in the need of prayer. We have a lot of people facing a lot of things in their lives. Lord, we just lift them all up to you. Some of these people have unknown what's in front of them. The only known thing is you, like the Ark of the Covenant traveled before them. And Lord, we trust that to be a confidence for them. Lord, for others, we know that they are enduring the rehabilitation of their bodies, the catching up, and perhaps just the strengthening of them. So, Lord, I just pray here and now that you would bless them with what they need in strength, in peace, in hope. Be with us all, Lord, that we may be faithful to the covenant of salvation you have called us to. And in Jesus Christ, we lift up our prayers and ourselves. Amen. May God bless you the rest of your week and your travels, and looking forward to seeing you this Sunday morning in our worship time.